And we are live. So Angela, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was a wonderful introduction. Hi, thank you all for being here. Thank you for getting here pretty promptly. And this is about color theory. So my specialty is color, and I really wanted to show you how I approach color from the idea of being a visual practitioner. So with that, would you mind sharing your screen, Brian? Let's see. So color for visual practitioners. Next slide, please. So we went over some of the housekeeping rules, but let's just ground ourselves and get ourselves kind of in the moment. So just to begin with, take a deep breath in, hold it, and breathe it out. Just ground yourself where you are. Think about your surroundings. If you know what the name of the ancestral land you're on, think about that. Just try to bring your full self to the table. Try to turn any notifications off so you can really stay present. And thank you so much for everybody having their cameras on so we get to see your faces. So just to put a question out there, if anyone wants to go off mute, I'm curious to hear if there's any of you that want to say, how have you used color in the past?
This is Jacob. I have two palettes that I use over and over and over and over and over again. One is bright and cheery, and another one is more serious. So I'm ready to get some more.
Great, thank you. That's great. Yeah, I love limited color palettes and like using ones for different situations and mood. And we're definitely going to talk about psychology. So if there's anybody else.
This is Elizabeth here. Nice to see you, Angela, and everyone else. I have avoided color. I'm a sculptor by origin, so I work with white porcelain and black clay. So those are colors, but they are, that opposite spectrum of color. So for me, I like color, and when I use it, it's more, oh, that looks like a nice color. I'll try that here. That's kind of the extent of it.
Fun fact, when I was in high school, I hated painting, so I refused anything to do with color. And then I got into college and fell in love. So I came from only liking black and white for a very long time. Okay, now let's start getting into the flesh and get over some of the basics of color. Next slide. Okay, so just to make sure we're all kind of on the same level, these are the basic colors we all know. We've got the Roy G. Bibb with the primary and secondary colors. So the idea with secondary colors is that you can mix the primaries together in order to make them. For example, yellow and blue make green. And the colors, two of which that Elizabeth already mentioned, is black and white. Now, technically, black and white aren't colors. Depends on who you talk to, but we work with pigments, and black and white are definitely things we work with. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is the importance of how many shades of gray there are and how you can really use gray to your advantage. Next slide, Brian. So back to that idea of grayscale. So one thing that we talk a lot about is this a blue? Is this a green? But what we don't end up talking about quite as much is this a dark blue or a light blue? And wondering how much black might be mixed into that blue if we want to think about actual paint, or if there's a lot of white mixed in, which might make the color really pale and very low saturation. So keeping the idea of tints, tones, and shades can completely change how you see color. A great example on this is, let's just look at the red right in the middle at the top. If you look at the top, that's obviously very red. But if you look in the center where it's considered with shade, so a hue plus black, it basically is brown. That's still a red, but it looks brown because of all the black that's added into it. And really thinking about that's really important when trying to build maybe a very good color palette, especially as we start talking about being colorblind or accessibility. Next slide, Brian. Okay, so to start getting in, now we know about the colors and how you can kind of manipulate the shades of them. But when you're picking a color palette, it's really cool to be able to start analyzing what type of color palette you want to use. So for example, we have our analogous, complementary, triadic, and split complementary. There are more color palettes out there, but these I would say are the most common you'll see, and I would say people use these the most. If you want analogous, which is personally my favorite, you get a very harmonious look. And then as you can see, complementary causes a very high contrast. You definitely see a lot of it of like yellow and purple or violet. And you see them used a lot in sports logos because it's a high contrast and it really draws the eye in. Triadic are especially used in kids media where it really just wants to catch your eye and just like blind you with the color. And so it can be really bright, really playful. And I find it to be the hardest of the color palettes here to kind of be able to put into a piece like really well. It's definitely very difficult because it's just so bright. And then split complementary is a great kind of, it's a little bit harmonious, but it's still that high contrast of the complementary. And it's a really great kind of middle ground if you want something really bright, but at the same time isn't like too much in your face. And you see monochrome, especially used in a lot of minimalist places. So you'll see it where it's very gentle on the eye. They really use a lot of shades and tints into it. It isn't just like a pure hue. You got your light, you got your dark, but it's all just one color. Okay, next. Okay, so now that we did that, I want people to come off mute and see if they can name the type of color palettes these are. There's some of these that are going to be like the pure hue, but other ones, there might be a little bit harder to name. Anyone can come off mute when they want. You can address the type of work by the credit of who they belong to.
So just a stab here. TFP meetings, is that one considered harmonious? Like, what is it? Analogous?
No, actually, that's an interesting guess though, because of the way that shades and tints are really used in this. I can see what you mean because it really is a very harmonious image. It's actually monochromatic because despite that, for example, the blue ribbon in the background is really, really light, it's still a blue. And same with the darker blue in the front. It's just very, very gentle on the eye, very harmonious, but it's considered monochromatic because it's all just shades of one type of blue.
Can I ask a bit of just to dig a little about what harmonious actually then means?
Harmonious kind of just means, would you mind going back, Brian? Oh, wrong way. So it's the name of the color palette itself is analogous, but when I say harmonious, it kind of is the mood that it creates. So when you see this color palette, it's very gentle on the eye. It's something that just kind of the colors flow into one another. A place to see some really fun analogous color schemes is if you look up pictures of the galaxy, and you'll see a lot of pinks and blues and purples, which are all right next to each other on the color wheel.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Let's go back to the other slide, Brian.
So would the A Krieg studio be the split complementary?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. So it could be split complementary or it could be complementary. Now, this is a really good example, besides that it's my work. It's a really good example of how this is where you can play and it doesn't have to be super strict. Because it is somewhere right between split complementary and complementary, because you've got your oranges and then you've got your blues. And if you want to break it down that far, you can say that, because technically all these yellows are still shades of orange, but I've just put them on different places on the color wheel that are a little bit more yellow, a little bit more red, but they're technically all oranges and all blues. But then you look at the blues and they're like, well, that's kind of green. And a lot of that also has to do with what colors you put next to each other. And it will look more green because of the color, this color or that color. So yeah, I would say that's split complementary. Anyone want to take a stab at Kelby Birds?
Hi. Would the one by Kelly Bird would then be analogous?
Yeah, that one really doesn't look analogous, but if you really look at it, all it has is reds, which bleed into orange, which bleed into yellow, And then you see this really light green that could be considered even a gray, and you might not even notice that it's green. And I love it when people do that kind of color, where you don't actually notice that it's a color. You think it's gray, but it's not. And so, yeah, this is a good example of analogous because they're all right next to each other on the color wheel, even though it's like 4 colors and maybe not 3 colors. Okay. So I asked this a little bit before, but I asked, who do you think uses color well? Is there anybody else how do you use color? I know we've heard a bit from Elizabeth, we've heard a little bit from Jacob, but do you guys think of it in these terms, or how do you really choose?
I think this is chiming in here. I think this is why this is so interesting, is because I've never ever thought about when it comes to like being at the wall or like on, digitally scribing, never thought about planning color in this way. I've only just thought about colors as signals and not really put a ton of thought into sort of their relationship to one another on the canvas. So this isn't like my first time kind of really naming some of these families. It's interesting.
Wow, that's a really cool point of view. It's kind of the idea of red is associated with a stop sign, and kind of just using, and this idea of signals, or maybe using colors within icons to really like press a meaning forwards, which actually starts bleeding into a little bit of the psychology of color, which we'll talk about briefly, but is really important on the idea of color. Brian, may we go to the next slide? So as I asked that before, is how do you use color? I think Portia gave a really good example of how she chooses it. She bases it off the signals that she's looking to represent. But these are the questions I ask myself when I'm going into a graphic recording is if I'm working with a brand, what are the brand colors? Sometimes you're limited to brand colors. I've done a lot of projects where I can only use 2 colors. And I'm like, but you didn't include white and black, so I have 4 colors. I have definitely done that before. But so you think about what colors you have. And then if you don't have as many, maybe there's a huge variety of colors, you get like the entire color palette that the company works for. You might go, okay, if it's the restaurant industry and we're talking about making people hungry more, then I'm going to do a lot of red and yellow, because those are colors really used in the restaurant industry. But not only that, but that starts bleeding into like, what is the mood and the topic? If you're trying to make people hungry, yellow and red is a really good combo. And however, if you're doing something that's more solemn, let's say you're working for a nonprofit that's talking about people who need help or don't have access to anything, sanitation, then you might do something that really tries to affect that mood and really talk about the suffering that people are going through. Next slide, Brian. So we've talked a little bit about this kind of throughout already, but it's really a lot about the psychology of color and how you really decide what are the colors. Now, I got some feedback that I used purple as an example last time, and I said it was, a color of royalty. So we associate it with, we really associate it with something like, luxury and again, royalty and such. But that's really like very based in European American culture. And that's something that's really cool about the psychology of color. It depends on what culture you live in. And there are countries that don't have the same names of colors that we do. I know that there's certain cultures that don't see the difference between blue and green, which I think is awesome, but know that a lot of the psychology that you have that might be associated with color are because of the European and Western society that we live in. So that's something really cool to think about, but just kind of keep this in mind. They say wear blue to an interview to keep people really kind of chill. And Brian is right. And he says that yellow is a color used in China for royalty, and I'm pretty sure that's right. I know red also has a super huge symbolism in China, although I can't remember it off the top of my head right now. Okay, and another one, pink. Pink is considered very feminine, although that's changing right now. Has to do with our modern times, as I think 100 years ago it was seen as a very manly color. So, which I love it when things switch it like that. Gender is a construct. Anyways, let's go to the next slide. So I got a pop quiz for you. Now we just talked about a little bit of why would you choose a color for a particular for like industries and such. And we talked about yellow and blue are, yellow and red are used a lot in restaurants. So why the heck would Starbucks choose green?
I think I remember reading their mission statement once, and it had something to do with like world improvement. They have this sort of message behind their company that they're like not a green company necessarily, but like it's not just about the food that they sell, but also the kind of atmosphere they want to cultivate.
Yeah. Does anyone agree with that or have anything contrasting to that of why they think it might be green?
Well, I guess could conceivably also set a mood of, happiness. If you go by your chart from the last image.
Yeah. So the story that I tell here is about Starbucks, about what they mean to me, at least as an individual, is there is a point of my life that I did a bit of backpacking around Europe, and it was great. And the two things I knew when I the two things I knew when I saw Starbucks, when I was in a foreign city, didn't know the language and everything, is that not only was I in a gentrified area, but I also knew that I was safe. I knew what Starbucks looked like on the inside. I knew what the drinks were. I knew what the food were. I could just go in, get my regular cappuccino, sit down, and just breathe in, breathe out. And I was welcome just because I'm paying for their food. And I knew where I was. It wasn't like I knew everything about like how to order food. It was all good. So a lot of what Starbucks, I think, really represents is, besides gentrification, I lived in Brooklyn, believe me. If you saw a Starbucks, you knew that you weren't in the old-fashioned kind of Brooklyn. You were in New Brooklyn, like Dumbo. But besides that, that green has a lot to do with what Julianne was saying, with kind of like that natural look and that feeling of like atmosphere they're trying to make. And we see green used a lot when you're in nature. You're sitting on your picnic blanket, and you got all this green around you, and it's a very calming, relaxing, and welcoming color. So that's a good example of color psychology based in Western culture, that is. Okay, next slide, Brian. Okay, let's also see where we are. Perfect, we're right on time. So another thing that we might want to talk about is, I don't know why the word quiz is in there, by the way, that was a mistake. I was fixing some text earlier, didn't fix all of it. But color can really help with hierarchy is kind of the idea. And as hierarchy, when you're making an image, you can use a lot of different things. For example, colors in the background in order to kind of group something together. Or you might have words a lot bigger in order to represent that. But you can also do it in order to create contrast and make certain things pop out more than others. So for example, in this one, we have a lot of banners. If you see, that's number 3. The banners are all these clouds. They're grouping information together. They're grouping different parts of the conversation. And yeah, you can also see that contrast is used to really like separate those banners. But the banners are a lot clearer because they're against this little bit of a darker blue background. Also, anyone want to take a guess of what kind of colors palette this is?
Monochromatic?
Yep. Exactly. So if you look, everything, the darkest color, which because of the lights it's on, you can maybe like write it off as black. That's just a really, really dark blue. And then you have the lighter blue. And if you notice, there's no white in this image. It's just a really light blue. And then you have this kind of mid-tone light blue. And then you have like, I would say a very pure, very saturated blue, which you can see the little guy, he's colored in with that color, and the shoe is drawn like that. So you can really use color to really make hierarchy that you could use, just with how you separate information, but you can really bring your eye to particular pieces of it, depending on what colors you choose to do. Okay, next slide, Brian. So this is something that Brian made. So this is complete. So he sent this to me. For anyone who works a lot with graphic recording and visual practicing pre-pandemic, you're probably really familiar with this, Neuland Markers. It is the visual practitioner's way of drawing on paper. It's the best. Showed Brian something earlier where I used it on my block print that I'm working on today. Actually, Julianne saw it too. Anyways, so he made this wonderful thing where we have, they're all coded by their numbers. And if I say something wrong, Brian, let me know. But he put them in this great color wheel. So you can see which ones are really yellow on the spectrum versus very purple. And it's just I love this. I know that he also really like color corrected it to make it as close to the real thing as possible. And if you want to go, I really want a dark blue, and I also want like a really light yellow. I find this to be a really cool resource. I'll include it in the notes at the end as well. And you have this 502, for example, here, and then you also have this color 300, and those two are really cool colors. And if you wanted to make a triadic color scheme that are all primary, you also have like 202, which can make this great triadic color scheme, but also make it so that the 202, if you noticed I said, that's a little less saturated than the blue, and it's almost like a mid-tone between the three colors. But a little less about that. Thank you, Brian, for letting me share this. I really appreciate this resource.
Sure. If I could just say, so functionally, the way that I actually use this is I'll say, because I love split complementary. That's the one that I always go to, just because you can do pretty much anything with it, and it's always really eye-catching. So I'll say I'll usually start with whatever I've already committed to the chart. Let's say that I'm doing a yellow title with the 501, then using that same across and then out of the split complementary, I might go from the 501 and say, okay, well, that means that my other colors I'm going to be using will be 300, 700, and then 200. So if you imagine that shape of what a split complementary looks like, I'll use this to wayfind myself through the colors that I'm going to use on the rest of the chart.
Yeah, I think that's great. You kind of like it's like you anchor yourself in one color, and then you kind of just find what the next colors are.
Yeah.
And
by the way, I'm really excited to take this class, because with the advent of digital scribing, I'm now not limited to all of the Neuland colors, and I find it a little bit overwhelming. I have to figure out exactly what I'm supposed to draw with now.
Yes, and yes. I personally love that, and and I love what you just said there, Brian, because I really find that true. And so one of my favorite things to do is I use the saying, some of the best creativity can be done in a box. So instead of creativity to the sky, it's like, okay, what can I do with this much space? And I find that a way to really cultivate creativity and not kind of get worried about like, oh my gosh, what do I do? So we're going to be going to breakout rooms, and when we do that, we're going to start analyzing color, because one of the best ways to get better at color is to look at color of people that you like, or a color of artwork that you like, and then say, wow, I really like that, and maybe even critiquing it further depending on what your goal is. So we're going to use the critique idea, which I think it comes from design thinking, right, Brian? And I'm going to demo what I mean by this. So I'm just going to name the three things that what I like, what I wish, and what if. So for example, one thing that I really like about this is the first thing that I really notice, like right off the top of my head, whoops, it goes into a hardware monitor. I really like that. Anyways, I really like that the first thing that I think when I look at it is split complementary. That's the first thing I think, because we have this blue and then we have these warm colors on the other side. Would you mind making it full screen? No problem. Okay. So we have these reds, we have these yellows, and we have these oranges. Those are all next to each other on the color wheel. But then we have this blue that's all the way on the other side. So I really, really like that. So one thing that I wish is, first of all, I think the image is pretty well balanced, but I am a little bothered that there's a little bit of color imbalance that I see. For example, there's some great red in the lower right corner that I kind of wish was behind the portrait of the man on the upper left. Like, I think it would just cause a bit more of a better balance. And for the what if is one I'm always curious, because this is done obviously digitally, is what if the color of the background was changed a little bit? For example, I'm wondering if the people in the middle, I don't really know. This might be the first time that I've noticed this, and I've already looked at this image a lot. I haven't actually noticed the people in the middle because of the whiteness of their shirt. So I'm like, what if he didn't use white? What happens if he used maybe like a gray or a really, really, really light yellow or something of that sort? these are my opinions. These are my curiosities. This doesn't mean there's anything wrong with this artwork. This is just a way to critique. And in order to critique, you need to know a little about color. And by doing so, you'll get better at color just by analyzation. So let's go to the next slide, Brian. Yeah, Brian's comment is perfect. So I'm going to break you guys out into breakout rooms. When I first got here, but when I first opened up, I said if you could have some paper and pen next to you, that would be great. Depending on how the groups are broken up, if one person could just take a few notes of what the group talks about. So when you're talking, talk about what you like, what you wish, and what if. And make it really only about the color. There's some of these that you might consider have a bit of compositional issues or something of that sort, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking straight about the color, and it doesn't even matter what the information technically is on there. For example, you can't really read Brian's, but which is cool. Don't get me wrong. This is really cool. We got great information, but it's not about the information. It's about the color. So yeah, if anyone could take some notes so you can share your thoughts after the breakout. The breakout is going to be 20 minutes, and then there will be a break after this, so you'll have some time to just chill and take a deep breath in and a deep breath out.
See you back in 20.
Groups. I took the notes for my group, Brian. I don't know if you did for yours this time.
Yep.
But let's just do a debrief, kind of one image at a time. For my group, for the first image, one thing that was talked about is how each individual segment really was very divided from one another. So it really kept the information separate and not cluttered. There was a lot of different wishes, but a lot of it had to do with balance. And to a certain extent, it felt analogous, but then it just kind of like, why is that purple in there is a big question. Like, we liked the purple, but a lot of the colors seem to be based off the logo. And so it's like, why is the purple there? And one thing that was pointed out, by the way, everybody else, feel free to just add in anytime. But one thing they talked about is like maybe making some of the colors a bit paler or not just so saturated as they are. And once you start looking at the white space in the lower left corner, you can't ignore it. That was a what if that white was used throughout the piece a little bit more in order to add more white space into the image.
Okay. For our image one, we had a like about the color blocks. A wish was, I wish there was a more limited use of color, that there's a lot happening there. It's a bit distracting, and a specific question around using the choice to use yellow on orange, that there might not be enough contrast. And I know we're going to talk about accessibility later. Also on image one, I wish there was more space in the colors. And with that space is that you actually get time to process what's there. That there's too many different things happening all at the same time. And then what if there was a different font that expressed the color differently?
Oh, that's interesting. The idea of maybe, for example, the white on the oranges, maybe if it was a much thicker font so that the color, like it might be less words, but the words would stand out more. So that's really cool. Huh. Yeah. When I did the pilot, there was a great comment, by the way, from one of our participants who said that they didn't like the panda because it looked like they got run over with a truck, and they thought of that as animal cruelty, which I loved. But that said, let's move on to the next. This image is done by Brian, and the things that we really liked about it is that we really liked how much bold those blues were for the titles. We really liked that. We also liked that there was a large amount of contrast within the image, and so each of the colors were very separate and very distinct, and that was really great. A different kind of a wish is wondering if there could be a different way of kind of using white, and if maybe there was more white space, or another idea going into the what if is that the figures kind of faded into the background a bit because they were white on white, and so maybe making the background like a super pale color, and so the white of the figures popped out more. Yeah, so those were some of the comments. And again, if anyone in this group has anything else to say, just jump in.
Good ideas. From our group, there was the idea of what if the colors actually touched each other? And then kind of opposed to that is I like that the colors do serve as a container for the content that's there. I like the use of the white fill of the illustrations, that the illustrations might be attached to bins. And then I wish that the headers had a similar contrast, that they kind of got lost in the colors. What if they were pulled out of the bubble and then otherwise attached to the illustration in some other way? And then the final thought on this one is I like the limited color use, the containerization, and that it's easy to see that there are 9 key points.
Yes, yes, would agree. So moving on to the last image, the third one. One thing that was really talked about is that this is Heather Martinez, by the way. And we really liked the colors at the bottom with the green and the purple. It was a really great way to ground the entire image, and they really liked that. And as well as the uses of the blues, they really thought the blues were really gorgeous, and how the title was this blue on the white. A wish was kind of to do with the yellow. The image itself has a lot of analogous going on with how the colors flow into each other. And then the yellow is really, really in your face and really bright, and wondering if that could be kind of toned down in order to fit the other colors a bit better. And wondering if some of the blues could be a bit bolder, because the blues on the background were a little bit too light to read for like the Q&A. And so what if the kind of some of the like that yellow and that red were a bit toned down, but the light blues in the background were a little bit stronger.
The yellow came up in our group too. It was actually called hyper yellow or neon yellow. And the what if there was more balance to its use, more consistency. And then the other thought around image 3 was, what if there was more generalized color?
Oh, interesting. What do you mean by generalized? Like,
I don't know. It wasn't my idea. If it was your idea, do you mind speaking up and kind of filling that in?
Yeah, I'm lacking words from the dictionary lately. So what I kind of meant was something where I was talking about how the background is monochromatic. And for me, what I want to see in this is that like my brain wants that there to be like less yellows and reds and maybe more mellow colors. That's all I meant.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, totally. And I think our group agrees with that, right? So is there any other comments that people want to make? Anything either funny or any other thoughts that neither Brian or I covered in our notes?
There's just one quick thing I just noticed about the last one is that the I am not sure what the title is. So I am okay. I'm reading the Colorado Experience Roadshow, but then I'm not sure what Duranium and Uranium Mania is. Was that something that was said? Was that something that's like a subheader? It feels like it's just in terms of hierarchy and use of the yellow color. It feels like it's important. Like it could be connected to the title, but I'm not totally sure.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really good example of how colors are really layered on top of each other. So some things pop out and some things fall backwards. And that I would say that the yellow is a lot brighter than even like it pops out to me more than just the white even. And so when I see it, it's kind of like you read the title. For me, at least, I read the title. I'm like, wait a minute, maybe that's not the title. Maybe the yellow is the title. And then it gets a little bit like your brain eventually moves on, but you're not really sure. Or at least that's what I find. Okay, so unless there's any more things, let's go to the next slide, Brian. We're right on time for a bio break. And just take your time. It's 7:05 here in EST, and take the 5 minutes that you need just to resettle yourself, and we'll see you then. Yeah. Well, welcome back, everyone. Or for the people who aren't here quite yet, we're just going to go into the next part. So let's get started, Brian. Hope your breaks were nice. So we went over a lot of information. This is a very kind of front-heavy presentation. So after you've had some time to process and when you get off this call, you might sit back and ask yourself this question. Okay, I just sat through this, and how the heck do I choose a color palette? Forgive my French. And so after you figured out some stuff, you really just like getting your anchors down. Like, you're working with a brand, what are their colors? Trying to figure out more about their industry colors. What topic are you doing? What mood you're doing? And you got all this information, but what do you really choose? Let's go to the next slide. So my biggest thing to you is, pun intended, don't recreate the wheel. Because the thing is that all that information you got to, you had just like, you're going to have a lot of anchors for whatever you decide to do. You'll either know it by the topic or whatever. All the things I just gave you with the brand, you might only have those colors to work with. So don't overthink it and go, oh, maybe I should darken the blue a little bit or do this a little bit. Try to keep it simple, because a lot of people, especially a lot of dead people, have figured it out before you. All the old masters are dead and they got color down. Use what they taught you. Steal like an artist. So be analytical, look at recordings that you like and say, hey, I love what Brian did. Let's see what colors he used. Maybe I could do something similar. Do that. There's nothing wrong with it. There really isn't. Be inspired by the people around you, and, know what you like. What color, and then kind of know what palette you're using. Do something with intention. Know what mood that it might create. And think about maybe the balance of how you're going to use color in a composition. And then where would you use the colors? I think it's really important to, yes, I'm going to be sharing that resource. There's some really fantastic resources for that. And this is one of my favorites that's on Instagram, at least, where you get to see different cinematography of really fantastic color from all sorts of films. I love it. I use it personally all the time for my personal painting work, because I'm like, wow, that's a great purple with a great green. Let me just add this into my program. Depending on if you're doing digital or not, they're on Procreate. You can steal color palettes from photography. It's not stealing it's stealing actually, because you're an artist. But it's fine. It's not a plagiarism thing. You're not copying somebody's artwork. It's okay to take color palettes from other artists. There's nothing wrong with that. So again, don't recreate the wheel because somebody else has already done it. So let's go to the next thing. So we're going to take a completely different turn. I talked about it a little bit, and I might not yet, but I'm going to ask Brian to not share his screen in a second. But something that people don't really talk about as much as they should is kind of the accessibility of colors. We all see color a little bit different, but some are going to see colors a little different, more different than others. And depending on if you're working with brand colors or whatever, you might be limited in what colors you're allowed to use. And so you're not going to really be able to make it beautiful for everybody. The most common kind of color blindness is where green and red are the same color. You can't see either of the difference between those two colors. I believe that's 99% of color blindness. There's about 300 million people in the world, I believe, with some kind of color blindness. And anyways, there's a few things you can do. Even if it's not pretty for people, you might be able to still make an image accessible to them. For example, one of the biggest things to remember, I've really mentioned kind of some of the importance of using tints, shades, and grays and such. Just because you're colorblind doesn't mean that you don't see the grayscale. Some people, like most colorblind people, can see the grayscale. And so being able to really make a high contrast behind your colors, even if they can't tell your blue from maybe your green, they'll still see that green is lighter and see the hierarchy of how you're using color. And there's a lot of problematic color combinations. And my biggest recommendation, because I don't have it really memorized off the top of my head, is like research what might be problematic color combinations. A lot of that, again, will be if you're using like a pastel green against a pastel red, they might look like the same color to people. And so why that might be problematic is because they're the same place on the grayscale. Another really cool thing I was learning when I was reading today, actually, was a way to make things more easier for people who are colorblind is by using patterns and textures and symbols and icons. because even if you can't see the color, you can recognize the meaning of the icon. That's also one reason, Portia, I got really excited when you mentioned before about like using color to really signal things. And I was like, icons! And I got really excited, but I was like, no, keep it together, Angela. And and one thing to really think about is I personally like limited color schemes. So take this with a grain of salt and know this is my personal opinion. But one really great thing about limited color schemes is that minimalistic design can help avoid confusion. So the more complicated it is, the less likely you'll be able to like make it as accessible for everybody. If you keep it simple, most people will be able to understand it probably. Okay, may you stop sharing your screen, Brian? I'm going to share mine. Okay, let me get the right slide open. Okay, wrong one. There it is, if it eventually loads. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share my screen at a really fantastic resource that I'm including also at the end. But I found this recently, Brian showed it to me. And this is a really cool resource, colorblindness.com. And you'll be able to kind of simulate to see how colors you go through different things. So here's one image I had. This is the original colors of it with these bright, this is a split complementary, one blue and then everything else on the other side of the color wheel. And you can start seeing what is it going to look like to people. It'll take a moment to load. And see, it's like, is this going to still be readable to someone who can't see greens and reds? Well, the reds that were within the oranges, they're getting muter, but you can still kind of see what color they are. So that's good. You can still tell the colors away from each other. And you can kind of just keep going through this. I'm also addicted to this because I think it looks really cool to see how colors change. But you can see it's like, okay, so things that are like really dark, you might be able to see or maybe not. And that's really great. Something fun to look at while putting it through the simulator is look at the logos you might include on your graphic recordings, because it's crazy how much that they could change. Okay, it looks like it's almost finished loading. If it doesn't load in another, let's see, what are we on time actually? Yeah, we still have 10 minutes, so we're fine. There it is finally. And you can see now this isn't where it's really starting to get lost. And yeah, you can tell the yellows, quote unquote, apart, but you're kind of losing it. And like the blues and everything else kind of looks like the same color at this point. So that's where it really starts getting lost. And a really good way, in my opinion, to build color, just from playing, like a great check that you can do for yourself is to look at everything in monochromatic no matter what. So this, for example, is a simulator for somebody who doesn't have any cones in their eyes and they only see in black and white. And so one reason why I'm really interested in the accessibility of colors is partially because people don't think about accessibility, but when I was in my freshman year of college, I met a guy who had 0 cones in his eyes. I think that's like 1 in 33,000 people are born with that. But he could tell colors apart from each other just by what tone they were on the grayscale, because that's all he saw was grayscale. And to me, that was mind-blowing. He was good friends with my roommate, and they would sit there and go over colors together and say, yeah, that's a purple. They couldn't see the color, so they'd have to guess, but they could tell because it was a darker tone on the grayscale. So a great way to really make things accessible or just look at things in grayscale, and if they look good, then add the colors gradually based on where they are on the grayscale to make high contrast to make it accessible to people. So that said, one thing I will say about when you're trying to make something accessible is when you're working with a brand or something, you might not have the ability. I work with a particular brand where most of their colors are on the same place on the grayscale. And believe me when I say it drives me absolutely insane. Because I'm like, I have to work with this and I can't make this accessible. This is fine. But sometimes you just don't have that choice. You just don't. And I don't think beating yourself up for somebody else's colors is really productive. But when you can add contrast in that can make it easier for everybody to see, then I think that's really great. So there's that. And I'm going to stop sharing. And Brian, you can bring up, I believe, one of the last slides. And the last slides are resources that I'm going to also copy paste into the chat. And these are really fantastic. One of these is the simulator. Another one is a really great article on colorblind friendly palettes. Let's see, website, did I, yep. Yeah, the vintage is a really cool kind of like really in-depth look at it. This Instagram is the Instagram that Brian shared and I shared as well, that shows kind of cool palettes from cinema. And Brian might have not seen me share this one before when I taught the class, which is called Coolers. Coolers is a really fantastic app. I have it on my computer, on my iPad, and it allows you to build color palettes and play with it really flexibly. So for example, there's this, and I can just generate. I love this. It is so addicting. And then I'm like, wow, that's a really cool dark green. So I'm going to lock that at top. And then you can keep playing, and you can keep that color green, but it will keep playing. And then I'm like, wow, that's a really cool, I don't like that one. I like this one better. And then you can keep playing. Let's see. And I'll keep those two colors. And you can just keep going until you build a palette that you like. And I love this. It's like, this is like candy for me. It's also really.
So Angela, is that, do you access that program? Is that its own app? Or
It's
is
its
that...
own app, but here's the thing. There is a direct import from that app into Procreate. So as soon as you've got a palette that you like, zap, it just shows up in Procreate. It's amazing. You can expand it out to 5 colors, 8 colors, 10 colors.
Oh my God, that's brilliant. So
I know, right? It's amazing.
I just got a coolers.co on my iPad and then do that.
Yeah.
I think it's something like $2. I think it's something like $2 or something of that sort. So it does cost something, but it's kind of like Procreate. It's really user friendly in the price. So it's really good. And I don't think it just is for Procreate. You can also use it on your desktop, and I think you can use it on any Android. I use it on my PC all the time, but I usually use it on my iPad. So I'm pretty sure it isn't just like an Apple thing. So with that, we have about 7 minutes left. And if we go to the next slide, I'm happy to take any questions or feedback. But thank you so much for everybody being here. And I'm really happy you enjoyed the breakouts. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Hopefully somebody learned something.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's show Angela some appreciation. Yay! Awesome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you so much, Angela.